Okay, so a quick summary of where we're at with respiratory viruses. COVID has more or less dropped out of news reporting now, and we are not seeing data published as frequently as we were 2 or 3 years ago. In fact, I think last month we hadn't got any data for about 6 weeks, but we have now. And if I just move that up there, we've got data up to a week ago. This time up to the end of May, and there's the flat. This is COVID cases. So we saw a big decline earlier this year, and then it's been flat since March, pretty much for COVID infections. So this is obviously a really good sign. We're not seeing these peaks anymore. And I think we were about here when we gave a talk last month. And since then, we can see that in May there was a little surge. Compared to all these other surges, it's pretty minuscule, but there was a little surge, and that kind of fits with the number of people who've told me that they've had COVID in the last few weeks. But that has already peaked and is falling away, so that's good news. Just thought it was worth mentioning on COVID cases. So this is the same data, but they've split it up to men and women, males and females. And interestingly, or incredibly boringly, depending on your viewpoint, if you look at female versus males, there were a lot more females getting infected. In fact, 50% more in October 2023 than males. So the blue line is for women and the orange line is for men. And throughout this period of time, from June last year all the way through till March, for some reason, women were getting more infections than men. Now, you can speculate as to why that might be. Women are maybe being more exposed to the virus. Who knows? But this is an kind of, I think that's quite an odd phenomenon, and just as odd, it stopped in March, and it's now pretty equal throughout April and May. So that's kind of a weird thing. I don't have an explanation for that. At the moment, where cases being reported are not particularly being reported in a complete way. We're only seeing some of the cases being reported. So maybe for some reason, female cases are being reported a little bit more than men, and the actual figure is more or less the same, but that doesn't fit with the fact that it's been equal since March from here. So I thought that was a kind of a slightly different bit of data to present, and kind of interesting, and maybe a talking point for some. This is quite fun. This has now been published, and this is not quite the history of the pandemic, but it is in a certain way. These are all the different colored lines are all the different COVID virus variants that we've been exposed to since the beginning of 2021, which is really quite. We had Alpha was the first thing and caused a huge amount of trouble, which is the yellow line. That died out completely, and you can see the pattern all the way through. A new sub species of the virus, which was Delta, came and dominated for probably twice as long as Alpha did, and so on. Omicron, which is the one that's been here ever since, first appeared towards the end and the beginning of 2022, so nearly 2.5 years ago. And since then, we've just had subvariants of the same virus: Omicron B, B1, Omicron BA2, Omicron BA2.75, Omicron BA2.86, and so on. At the right at the moment, the one that's causing us the small amount of trouble that we are seeing is still Omicron, and it's an Omicron JN1, whatever that means. Just a name for the latest sequence to form of COVID. So we're still going through this pattern of new species, subspecies being generated as time goes on. And it's still happening now, but this new species is clearly much less aggressive, causing far fewer problems than Delta or Alpha did all those months, all those years ago. So there's plenty of the virus around. It's just not causing anything like the problems that this virus was causing us. So that's all good news. COVID, insofar as most of the population of the country is concerned, is over. It was officially, I think I've got summary here. Yeah, so small surgery in May, now over. If you are called for vaccination, it means you're in a vulnerable group, and a lot of people here I'm talking to are classified as vulnerable. So keep up your vaccinations when called, and that's the best way you can stay protected. I thought I had another slide. Maybe it's a bit later. Okay, down there. Okay, so that's that. Next slide. And we also talked a little bit about other respiratory viruses, but unfortunately, there's nothing much to talk about. This winter's flu has now gone. It surged over winter. It wasn't very high, and it's completely disappeared now, virtually. Another virus called RSV, which is a cold virus, essentially, mostly affects youngsters. Also surged, but is also now gone. They're both now at very low levels, and all the other viruses that are recorded are still at low levels or are falling. So it's all good news at the moment. This is a great time for people who suffer from these infections. There aren't very many around, so you'd be very unlucky to get infected. During the pandemic, all research that I'm aware of, certainly all research here and all research across the country at all the hospitals across the country, all those clinical trials, and there are hundreds of them, stopped because those trials could no longer run because we no longer had access to hospitals to run those trials. So a lot of research efforts instead went into COVID with all the results that we all know about. But just to illustrate, times have changed. COVID pandemic, as far as research is concerned, is pretty much over. And I've found 32, let's see, yes. Yeah, oops. Yeah, at the moment, I looked for clinical trials that are started up now, are running now, or are about to run now, as an illustration of the amount of research into aspergillosis that is back up and running. And this is worldwide. And this particular website, www.clinicaltrials.gov, is run in America, but it refers to clinical trials from all over the world. It's not a complete record of every single clinical trial. Yeah, it has to be a sort of a clinical trial that costs a reasonable amount of money. There are lots and lots of much smaller trials around UK and the rest of the world that don't make it on this list because they're only quite small trials. They're probably not as accurately controlled. These would be small trials which would lead up to these bigger trials, and that's when we would learn about them. But I just thought it'd be interesting to review what trials there are now running on aspergillosis, just to give you some idea of the level of research that has started up again and is carrying on. So you can search this website for keywords, and all I did was search this website for the keyword aspergillosis, and I found 32 records of clinical trials that are currently running, some of which are ours, and I'll go through those as we go through the list. And I categorize them as follows. Some of them are about diagnosis and detection. And some of them, so part of the reason that this is quite interesting is some of this research is research that started up 4 or 5 years ago and had to shut down again and is now restarting. So this is stuff we've been holding back, and it's really nice to see that this research is reaching prominence again. And this particular one is really interesting because, in fact, we were talking earlier this week to someone who has what appears to be either a cancer tumor in their lungs or an aspergilloma in their lungs. And this is a relatively common dilemma for oncology physicians because they look identical for a long period of time. You can't tell the difference. And then the only way to really decide without any amount of doubt straight away is probably to do a biopsy. I mean, you can do lots of other tests, but a biopsy is probably the gold standard. There are examples of some cancers being treated, particularly lung cancers being treated as cancers for months and then being exposed to surgery or whatever. And this so-called tumor hasn't responded to the cancer treatment, and they've actually found it's actually a ball of fungus. So it is really important that we can tell the difference between the two, and at the moment we can't. Of course, if it's treated as cancer and removed as a tumor, it doesn't really matter that it's actually aspergillosis because you've also removed the aspergillosis. So the treatment in the end is similar. So it is generally not an absolute disaster, but you really need to be using the right drugs. You need, if it's fungus, you need to be treating with antifungal drugs. So we need to know as soon as possible when we have one of these objects identified in somebody's lung. And as you can see this picture here, that's just such an object. That's quite a big one. But this one is something called a PET scan, which is a positron emission tomography. It's not CAT scan or CT scan as such. The patient is given particular substances which pick out characteristics that are common in cancers. So, for example, you can give a patient a radioactive variant of glucose, and if some part of their body is using a lot of glucose, when they do the scan, it'll light up like this, and you can see that area is growing quite fast, and that's a clue that might be a cancer ball of cells that's growing faster than the rest of the than the rest of the tissue around in the lung. If we could find something that picks out aspergillus instead of a cancer, then that would be really helpful. And they're doing this study in Radboud, which I think it's either Holland or Belgium. I think it might be Belgium. And it's called the Mirage trial. All these trials are producing these acronyms now. So the imaging pulmonary aspergillosis using gallium-68 deferoxamine, Mirage. Now, something we've known for a long time, in fact, all the way back to when I used to work in microbiology for my PhD, we knew that microbes produce these substances called siderophores, which is this word down here. And the function of a siderophore is to grab a scarce element from the environment and carry it back to the fungus or the other microbe, it's fungus in this case, to enable that microbe to carry on growing. Now, iron is in short supply for most fungi, at least within our bodies, but probably in the environment as well. There is iron in our bodies, so there's iron in our blood, for example, but it's not available to the fungus. The fungus can't get at it. So they produce these siderophores to grab any iron in their environment with high efficiency. Now, this study is using that fungus-specific activity against the fungus, because if we give this fungus, which is grabbing all the iron it can in the vicinity, a radioactive version of iron, the fungus will grab onto it, and then we should be able to see it like that. And the other advantage is cancer cells don't produce these siderophores. So if this picture was of the Mirage study, then that glowing object there would almost certainly be an infection, and it could easily be a fungal infection, and it's definitely not cancer. So that's a really interesting study, and it would be really useful if we get positive results out of these studies. There are PET scanners now everywhere across the UK. I know Christie's have more than one, I think. It's effectively a super duper CT scan that can detect particular types of radiation. So that is a really exciting study, and is directly helpful to people would be with people who may have CPA. And I know I think there are people quite a few people in the group who've been through that situation, so it could be very helpful. Also in the detection field, something that's being looked at in Canada. If you look for volatile organic compounds in the exhaled breath of somebody, you're looking for chemicals that are dissolved in air that they're breathing out, essentially. And one of the problems that we have, as you all know, is that it is really hard to detect aspergillosis if it's growing in your lungs at first, and it's really important to start treatment as soon as possible. So we need methods to detect aspergillosis growing in somebody's lungs as soon as possible after it's started. And this study is going to look at the exhaled gases, or these compounds in exhaled gases, to see if we can pick up those gases that are produced by the fungal infection earlier than in other ways of it detecting these things, like using blood tests and so on, because it should be a really sensitive way of doing it. And if we can pick up these infections much earlier, and it's obviously a very non-invasive technique, so it's very low risk. We could do this for lots of people if needed. It will be a terrific way to cut down on the amount of CPA, possibly ABPA, damage caused by starting treatment later, later rather than earlier. So that could be a really nice, that study could have a really nice end point for us. And it's easy to see that this could be useful to screen for CPA or any aspergillosis occurring in the airways. So that's a really interesting study as well. I think I've got another few to look at. Still on detection. Oh yes, this one. If you've ever had a bronchoscopy and they've taken a sample from your lungs, that's usually been bronchoalveolar fluid, or BAL for short, I think it is, which works, and it does a good job, but it might be faster if we could just take, instead of passing that small amount of fluid into your lungs and then sucking it back up again. So that's how you do these things. You have your bronchoscope, you pass a small amount of liquid into the air spaces, then you aspirate it out again, and that fluid will be what you test. This in particular became an issue during the COVID pandemic, which seems to be a theme this week or this month. If you're adding these liquids in and then aspirating, you're generating aerosols, and that's the last thing you need to do in an operation when the patient may have COVID. So it started back then when they were trying to find out ways to cut the risk to everybody who had to go through this procedure from COVID. Just taking samples of bronchial secretions cuts down that risk and may turn out to be more sensitive than doing a bowel as well for certain types of fungal infection. So it's a kind of an example of COVID forcing an adaptation which may actually turn out to bring benefit to all patients, not just patients with COVID, because we might be able to more sensitively detect fungi in bronchial secretions. And I think there was another one. Well, that's the same one. They're looking at testing what they remove from their lungs with PCR to detect resistance to antifungal drugs. I think that's coming up in a bit. Moving on to natural history, that's just the investigating how these things grow and how they infect and so on. It's just the whole picture of infection and so on. A US study is calling itself the Natural History and Pathogenesis of Human Fungal Infections. So it's not specific to aspergillosis. Well, a lot of it is about aspergillosis because that's probably the most common infection in lungs. And they are doing a large study. It's taking place over 10 years. And they're going to look at people and whole families who have seem to have a vulnerability to aspergillosis. So they're going to look at the genetics of people with aspergillosis from their families and other fungal diseases, obviously. They're going to collect all the tissue, they're going to look at their immune system, and they're going to do this every 6 months while the patient who has the fungal infection is being treated. So this is just a big study that will be going on for years and years and may well tell us a lot about the genetics and the natural history of how these infections occur, what goes on in the patient before and after these infections, what goes on while we're treating the infections and so on. That it's a sort of 360-degree study, which is very encouraging that there is funding to do this over such a long time period. So that should also be very useful. Then we look at treatments. We've been telling you for some time that there are more antifungal drugs coming. And this is one of them called opolconazole. As you might make out from that name, it's another azole family type of drug. And this is a study which is now in phase 3, so that means it's going to go out to a large population, and it's one step away from coming into the clinic. This has been held back by pandemic for 3 or 4 years, maybe longer. So it's great to see it finally progressing. This is an antifungal that will be delivered using a nebulizer. It's produced by a company called Pulmicide. We've already done some preliminary work to the phase 1s and the phase 2s with this particular drug, and we're quite hopeful that this is going to be very useful. But we need to prove it's safe. We need to prove it's effective in order to get it funded. London, I think it's Imperial College or it might be King's, and Wythenshawe are doing this study. So in actual fact, you may be asked to participate in this study because we are recruiting on this right now, and so are the people in London. It's actually for invasive pulmonary aspergillosis rather than chronic pulmonary aspergillosis, but there's often scope to include a few CPAs into a study like this just to see on a small scale how useful it might be for CPA and ABPA. Most of these trials start off, pretty much all of these trials start off with the acute infectious variant of aspergillosis, simply because that's where the most patients are and the highest need is, because these people are critical and need treatment straight away. So an awful lot of research goes into trying to help those people, but at the same time, as a spin-off, they often end up helping CPA and ABPA patients. So that's really good. We may be hearing more of that, about that in a year or two when we have the results. This one's called the OPERA-T study, and I hadn't actually heard of it before I looked this up, so that's really interesting. Again, here we've got a new drug here and in London, but this one is more Manchester-based because the company that make it called F2G, they've been making this drug for 15, 20 years, actually, and that's how long these things take to get to market. This is an evaluation for use of this new drug called olorifim. It's phase 2, so it's 2 steps away from actually coming to clinic. There's all sorts of reasons why this is a better drug. It's not an azole for a start, so it's a new drug class. I don't think there's much. I think it's quite resistant to developing resistance to it, if you understand what I mean. So again, this is another one where there's fairly high hopes this will add value to the drugs that we already use in clinic. The trial will look at this drug treating invasive fungal infections in patients where, because it's a different drug class, in patients that have no other treatment options. They've already gone through all the usual azoles and the other options, echinocandins and so on, and become their infection has presumably become resistant. This is a new class of drug, so this can be used to treat those patients. So we are running this trial in Winshaw, so again, this is something you might be asked to participate in. This is being directed at CPA, I think. So that's really interesting, and you may be hearing about that study. Obviously, it has to go through a phase 3 before it actually becomes mainstream, because only after a phase 3 can the drug regulators tell whether it's worth paying for patients. If it's not, well, it seems unlikely for this one because there isn't an alternative. Another azole, they might say, well, you might as well use posaconazole. Why should we pay for this new one if there are no demonstrated advantages, and so on? So that's really encouraging. That's running right now, and you may hear some more about that. Another treatment one. Oh, this is quite interesting. This is actually an attempt to treat bronchiectasis. Instead of talking about CPA or ABPA, this actually starts with bronchiectasis patients. And we know bronchiectasis is strongly associated with fungal infection. This study is happening in India, where they have a slightly different population of infected people compared to the UK. We have a lot of ABPA, for example, although we don't have quite so much. Treatment of ABPA, we know that treatment of ABPA with an antifungal drug benefits patients. What they're going to do with this trial is to treat patients who have bronchiectasis and see if it helps them. The original way we did the ABPA trials was in not quite the same, because in ABPA, obviously, we know there's evidence that you have an aspergillosis infection. It's unclear from what they write to me whether they're just going to treat bronchiectasis patients and look for improvements, or they may need some evidence that that patient has a fungal infection before they do it. But anyway, it's an attempt to treat bronchiectasis with antifungal drugs, and the one they will use is the same as the one used for ABPA, which is itraconazole. And this is a phase 3, so that again, that's fairly close to coming to clinic. So that's really interesting for people with bronchiectasis. This one is another one that is being run here, so that's 3. We know this is particularly a Manchester trial because I'm doing some work with it. It's again for patients who don't have any other options for antifungal drugs, because their infection has become resistant to all the azoles and every other drug that we currently can use. What we do know is a lot of those patients seem to have low levels of interferon gamma in their blood and in their lungs. And that's an interesting observation in itself. We've already done a small-scale study where we give those patients supplementary interferon gamma, and those patients have benefited. They have less admissions to hospital. They remained much more stable than if they hadn't received interferon gamma. So we're taking it to the next phase, which is phase 2. And that is started up a week or so ago. So we're currently inviting people into that trial. And that trial is just being run in Manchester at this stage. So that is tremendously encouraging. It's not even an antifungal drug. It's something that stimulates part of your immune system to fight off the infection. And this was a world first. This is happening in Belgium, France, and Switzerland. They've actually identified a gene, which is PTX3, which has something to do with susceptibility to fungal infection, in particular aspergillosis. So this is the first time they've actually targeted patients who have the defective PTX3 gene with antifungal prophylaxis prior to giving them a treatment. And in this case, the treatment is treatment for acute myeloid leukemia. So what would be happening is there's probably, I don't know, about 10,000 of these patients a year in the UK anyway. And they would test them for PTX3. If they're positive and that they're vulnerable to fungal infection, they will then give them this antifungal. As you're aware, we often do not like to give prophylactic antifungals because we don't know who's susceptible. It would result in us, if we don't know who's susceptible, we're giving that quite aggressive drug to patients who don't need it. That's something that we try to avoid quite a lot. So if we've got a screening tool such as this genetic mutation, it means we can actually start using prophylactic treatment, which will be posaconazole in those cases. And that principle, picking out patients who are vulnerable by looking at their genetics, has never been done before for aspergillosis. It's the first trial of its kind that's ever been done. So that's tremendously encouraging, and a glimpse into the future of personalized medication that's happening right now. Slightly interesting one, which I found. I had to look up what an ascaris is. I don't know if any of you know what ascaris is, but it's a roundworm. So effectively, and this is being run in Uzbekistan, so it's quite unusual. And what they found is if someone has COPD, and quite a few of those people we know get aspergillosis, do they also tend to get a roundworm infection, which is not something we worry about here too much. I don't think there's much roundworm in the UK, certainly in adults. So it's just that's a quirky kind of different trial, which I thought I would include. The link between roundworm infestation, COPD, and aspergillosis. Never heard of it before, but that is a trial that's also running way out east of here. Okay, so those are all the ones that I thought I would highlight. There are 32 in all, so quite a few others. Not many on CPA or ABPA, but as I said, that the reason for that is they tend to concentrate on treating acute invasive aspergillosis first. We've probably all heard of the Mediterranean diet. I'll just give you a bit of the history. Have I spelled Mediterranean right there? I'm not sure I have. It looks wrong to me. We have known for some time that the Mediterranean diet reduces the risk of cardiovascular risk and diabetes risk. This diet is held up as the recommended diet for good health in regards to those health problems and also in many more ways. And it was originally proposed by a man called Ansel Keys and his wife Margaret as far back as the 1950s. So this isn't new. This goes well back to not long after the end of the Second World War. And so just to tell you a bit more about it, it's based on the diet of the people that live in southern Italy, in other words, these areas, Naples, Puglia, Potenza, and I presume Sicily. The people in southern Italy are the people on the right in this picture. The people on the left will be northern Italy, just to illustrate they're a lot more money, it's a lot more industrial, and they're a lot better dressed, subjectively. People on the right are more southern Italy. It's much more of a rural area. It's not as affluent. People don't tend to be so fashion conscious. All the big fashion houses are really in the northern Italy, for example, and all the cars and everything else. Southern Italy is farming country, essentially. Now, this talk is mostly taken from an article that's just been published in New Scientist, so you can look that up if you wish. But I'll give you a summary of the article now. What was the Mediterranean diet? So Ansel was one of the first to propose the principle that saturated fats, i.e. fats found in red meat and dairy, tend to promote the buildup of fat lining arteries via cholesterol and then giving us heart disease, essentially. He recommended to stick to unsaturated fats. I remember this being given to us back in the 70s and the 80s, this advice. Unsaturated fats are mostly found in fish and plants. The couple built on this suggestion, once they made this observation, they built on this suggestion by studying the diets of groups of people around the world. During this time, they noticed a group of people that lived in southern Italy that contained a large number of people aged over 100. Now, it's not recorded whether any of those people are aged over 100, but I suspect not. They argued that a major factor that caused this longevity was diet. And it has since been referred to as the Mediterranean diet. The couple were so convinced that the diet made this change. I think they also recognized the lifestyle, even at that stage, was a different lifestyle. The lifestyle of a farmer is one of not overeating and plenty of exercise and eating quite plain food as well, I would have thought. They're so convinced that that the diet and lifestyle of people in southern Italy promoted long life and good health that the couple moved to live there. And just to give you the end point of their personal experiment, Ansel died in 2004 and he was aged 100. Margaret followed 2 years later, aged 97. So arguably that their own personal experiment with living in southern Italy was a success. They were both more or less centurions by the time they passed away. So there is something that reinforces the idea that there is something about the diet eaten in this part of southern Italy that gives us longer life and better health while we're in longer life. Southern Italy is traditionally rural and quite poor, so foods like pizza, lasagna, moussaka is a Greek dish, of course. Indulgent foods are not eaten very much. Certainly weren't back then. And since then, a lot of work has been carried out to try and describe what it is that makes this diet special. What it is about this diet that gives long life and good health. First of all, you have to actually define what you're doing. So one of the most widely used definitions, and there are several variations on this, but the one that is most widely used is called the Mediterranean Diet Score. This was developed in the 1990s in Greece. And what it is each food component was given a score, and then you would add up the score and you would come up with a figure for each person or each group of people. I'll tell you a bit about the diet first. Those parts of the diet that are low in saturated fat, high in monounsaturated fats, which is what we talked to, are mainly from olive oil. The carbohydrates mostly come from grains and legumes, beans and that type of thing. And the diet is high in fiber, which we've talked about an awful lot over the last 5 years. It's fiber being really good to look after your microbiome in your gut. Fiber mostly coming from vegetables and fruits. So you can see where the advice from the NHS on diet is coming from. Total fat may be high, which you might be surprised at, but the monosaturated fat ratio should also be high, so more monosaturated than saturated fats. Actual foods and dishes include large quantities of whole grain bread, cooked meat, meals, soup and salads rich in olive oil. Legumes and vegetables are consumed in large amounts. Not only that, intake of milk is rather low. Now they've actually gone back on that definition a little bit, and now saying that milk is neutral in this respect. But things derived from milk, such as cheese and yogurt, are eaten a lot in this part of Italy, so they could be part of promoting long life. Fatty cheese is regularly added to most salads and vegetable stews. Meat was expensive until very recently, so very little red meat or meat of any kind is consumed in this part of southern Italy when this diet was investigated. And fish consumption in the areas adjacent to the sea were high, but not all parts of this part of Italy are close to the sea, so that wasn't universal by any means. High content in the diet of vegetables, fresh fruits and cereals, and I've highlighted the liberal use of olive oil. I'll go into that in a bit more detail in a bit. These guarantee a high uptake of all these nutrients, beta-carotene, vitamin C, tocopherols, important minerals, and so on, including beneficial non-nutrient substances like polyphenols and anthocyanins. Happily, wine is consumed in moderation and almost always during meals, but it is part of the diet. You're allowed to drink wine, or wine is viewed as good for you. They developed this diet score I just mentioned. If you get a higher score, you've eaten more food items that are good for you. If you get a low score, you've eaten fewer of them. What they did was they looked at several villages in this part of Italy, and they found some people, by no means everyone ate the same diet. Some people scored higher and some people scored lower in these villages. So they grouped all those people together and looked at them for a long time and looked at the number of those people who actually died. Interesting to note, throughout this area, cigarette smoking was common. So all this data occurs despite smoking being common. And they did this study. Very simple. Group 1, the Mediterranean diet score is bigger than 4. Group, I think that's a 0. The Mediterranean diet was less than 4. And as we know, high numbers are better than low numbers. And that's exactly what they found. They found that their diet score, the Mediterranean diet score that they'd invented, actually reflects people living longer, compared to people who are not eating so many of those food types, live less long over a period of 5 years. So that's really interesting. That validates the diet score and also validates the theory that there's something about the diet that increases lifespan. So the original summary of the Mediterranean diet was lots of vegetables, legumes, fruit and nuts, cereals, and moderately high amounts of fish, liberal use of olive oil in cooking and eating and so on, little meat, poultry and dairy, and perhaps finally a moderate amount of alcohol. So we've already read that. So this is mostly lots of plant foods with some fish and a little bit of meat. That's essentially NHS recommendations at the moment. So it's not difficult to see where that comes from. There have since been developments of this original summary, because the original summary was developed back in the 1990s. 2011, it was recommended that fizzy or sugary drinks were excluded. I presume that meant they were included in the latest version of the diet in 2011. Dairy is now considered not to be bad for you as much as it was. And sadly, not as much alcohol is allowed to stick with the diet. It is still difficult to find a universal consensus. There are lots of different variations on this Mediterranean diet. I think what I'm talking about is the Greek version of it, but that seems to be one of the most widely accepted. There is very good evidence that this diet works because there's been lots of studies. And 2022, a study called CardioPred suggested Mediterranean diet rather than a similar diet but low-fat diet was an improvement in that it caused a reduction in the chances of a second cardiovascular event in people who have already had one. So it's very good for your cardiovascular system. Very good proof. At the time, there's a Cochrane review that comes up with the same data, and that work also illustrated that you have a 20% less risk of developing diabetes as well. This diet works. So basically, it's a good diet. However, and this is the bit that's new to me, I've been talking about diet and the promotion of health for years now. This bit was the new bit in this article for me. However, we now know, or we've now looked at, that this Mediterranean diet does not work for everyone. In a study in southern Italy, again, reported in 2018, they went into the data in a bit more detail and found that, or concluded that, if you belong in a low-educated group or a low-income group, this protection was not seen. So the Mediterranean diet doesn't work for you, even if you live in the same area, southern Italy, and you come from a low-educated or low-income group. Why must that be? They've speculated that poorer people tend to buy cheaper, lower quality food that is more processed. I don't think that's been formally investigated, so that needs to be investigated, but that sounds a lot like what we're talking about in the UK now, sort of 20 years later. We need to eat less of this processed, cheaper, lower quality food, and we're trying to work out how to achieve that. Another clue, not all olive oil works. Olive oil seems to be a major part of this protective effect. And the good stuff, and also the most expensive stuff, is produced by grinding and pressing the olive oil fruit and just letting the oil run out. Once that's happened, they can get more olive oil out by processing, sometimes by heating. And what they think now is that if you've got the good stuff that's just pressed, and that is protective to your health, your cardiovascular health and diabetes. If it's processed further, it is much less effective. So that's an important point. Sadly, we've got to pay for the expensive olive oil if we want to take advantage of this reported benefit. They've got some idea why that might be. Extra virgin olive oil contains these polyphenol substances. And if the oil is processed, the oil tends to lose these polyphenols. And if you look at these polyphenols more closely, they've fed them to mice. Those mice that were fed had benefited from lower blood pressure and also an altered microbiome. So removing these polyphenols by processing would potentially cause the loss of that benefit. Also, some people, based on their genetics, don't react in the same way. But essentially what they're saying is that even though the diet is generally beneficial for everybody, for some people, there may be a different version of the diet that works better. We don't have any details on what that might be as yet, but that's being worked on. Does it have to be the salads that we all know about from visiting the Mediterranean countries, tomatoes, aubergines, peppers, and all that. As we develop this idea, the principle of the Mediterranean diet, researchers are giving the opinion that there are some components of the diet that have the major effect, i.e. the olive oil. But others, for example, somewhere like the UK, where we eat far more in the way of root vegetables and other types of vegetables, those vegetables would probably replace the aubergines and the peppers without there being any loss of protective effect. And there's more to it than just the olive oil, but it's very complicated at the moment, so we won't go into that. But it does seem that they're refining the advice for the more northern European countries to take advantage of this impact, and also would be cheaper in the non-Mediterranean countries than imported salad, vegetables and aubergines and peppers and everything else. Non-surprisingly, lifestyle is also important, and the rural lifestyle in southern Italy is liable to be very active. There are studies that have been done that showed 500 steps a day and a type of strength training also lower cardiovascular risk. So that might be part of the answer why people in southern Italy have a lower risk of these of cardiovascular problems. But another thing they do is they cook fresh, and we're doing less of that now. So it's probably a good idea to cook fresh and then sit down and eat with people for your mental health as well.
Waseema.
Okay, coming to the end.
No, just letting you know.
Good timing. Conclusions from all of that: diet is important. Lifestyle is important. Adopting the whole Mediterranean diet will help most people live longer, more healthy lives. Make sure you use the extra virgin olive oil while cooking and eating as much as possible. That is where a lot of the benefit seems to stem. Reduce processed food. We are now calling ultra high processed foods. There's a movement in the UK to push food producers to produce those less in the UK. At the very least, we know that the Mediterranean diet does no harm. It's worth trying. It does no harm. It's full of everything you need in a healthy diet. Plus, it's got that X factor, the olive oil or whatever other things benefit. Regular, frequent, doesn't have to be vigorous exercise. Gentle exercise is good. Regular and frequent is more important. Exercise is important, and I think it's become obvious as this story is. So it's already 50 years old. We have a lot more to learn in this area, so keep an eye on developments. You can look at the NHS's advice on the diet you should follow. It's not exactly a Mediterranean diet, but there are elements in there that are consistent with the Mediterranean diet, and this is the diet that the NHS advised for all of us to maximize our health. Most of the components of the Mediterranean diet are in there. This summarizes the Eat Well diet, Eat Well guide that you can get on the NHS website. You see the proportions of the different sorts of foods that they would prefer you ate and what types of foods. Lots of pulses and things, and fish. Very little red meat in that picture. And what there is fish and chicken and white meat, essentially. And that's it.
So my name's Waseema. I'm one of the respiratory speech and language therapists in the Manchester Airways service. So I've been asked to speak to you today about upper airway disorders, specifically something that we call inducible laryngeal obstruction, that we diagnose, assess and treat within our service. So my plan today is to kind of give you a bit of an overview of what my role is within the service, what we do as MDT, the assessments that we provide and the intervention that we give as well. So Manchester Airways service is one of maybe 4 or 5 tertiary services within the country that provides assessment and treatment for, as I said, specifically upper airways disorders. As speech and language therapists, we kind of sit within that team. So why would somebody refer to our service? So we receive referrals from across the country, and normally the question that they're asking us is this ILO? Now, as we move forward with the presentation, I will explain what that is. A lot of the time, with these referrals, the patients that they're referring into us, they've got symptoms of choking attacks, shortness of breath, stridor, which is noisy breathing, aphonia, which is where they either lose their voice or have difficulties speaking, dysphagia, so swallowing difficulties, or odnophagia, where they feel that they are struggling to kind of get food or drink down. So this can have a huge impact on people's lives. They'll end up making regular A&E visits, and they'll be placed on medications like inhalers, steroids, which are unnecessary for the treatment of this condition. And there's a lot of fear and panic around this condition as well. So as I said, the speech and language therapist, I sit within the Airways MDT, and you can see my team there. So we're a group of doctors, speech therapists, physiotherapists, psychologists, and we have a specialist nurse as well. So once that referral comes in and that individual is triaged into our service, we'll assess them. We'll provide them with what we call a one-stop assessment and laryngoscopy. So they'd come in for a full day, where we'd see them in the morning, and we'd then assess them between us, and then in the afternoon we'd complete a laryngoscopy to see if we can make a diagnosis. So what is ILO? So you can see here, you've got your lungs, you've got your breathing pipe here, and then on top you've got your larynx, or your voice box. So what we're trying to do is diagnose and treat ILO. So what is ILO? ILO is a term that we use to describe a narrowing of your vocal cords. Okay, so your vocal cords will narrow, and as a result you will struggle to breathe in. Okay, and this can be very debilitating, and it can cause a range of symptoms for patients, which can be mild, moderate to severe, and when it's severe it can cause panic attacks and loss of voice, as I said earlier, and lots of noisy breathing as well. So what do people with ILO report? So they'll say things like, my inhalers don't really work, I feel like I'm gasping for air, I feel like my throat is shutting off, I feel like I'm being strangled, or I feel like I'm breathing through a straw or a slit or cling film. So these are quite common reports from patients that we get. So what does your breathing normally look like? So here you've got an image of a lovely larynx. So when we put the camera down, the laryngoscopy, this is the image that we'd be able to visualize and see. So I'll explain what you've got here. So down here is your breathing pipe, your trachea. That's your opening, the air entry for your airway. These white bands here are your vocal folds, and their primary use is for voicing. So when we talk, when we produce sound, these white bands come together, and that's what allows us to produce voice. Okay, and this leaf-shaped structure here is your epiglottis, and when we swallow, this flap closes over to stop any food or drink dropping down into your airway. So as you can see here, this area is extremely important. Okay, there's four primary functions, one being for breathing, one being for swallowing, and one being for voicing. Okay, now this is what we would expect to see. As you breathe in, everything stays nice and open, and as you breathe out, typically everything would stay nice and open like this. Now, when you've got ILO, inducible laryngeal obstruction, here you can see what happens. So this is what things would look like normally, nice and open. You can easily breathe in and out. When you've got ILO, you can see that this is very reduced. The space is significantly reduced, and there's very little space there for the individual to get that air in, and that's what causes the panic and the noisy breathing as well. Okay, so this is not a life-threatening condition. However, it can be very scary for individuals. As you can imagine, if you're struggling to breathe and your breathing is noisy, people around you can kind of panic as well. So yeah, it's really important that when we see this, we reassure the patients as well that it's not life-threatening and there are ways that they can manage this. So I'm going to show you a video now of what happens when somebody is having an ILO attack, as we call it, or an episode. So you can see that narrowing as the video goes along. There isn't any sound to this. However, if you keep watching, you will see the vocal cords starting to narrow and come together. Okay, play that now. So what is the speech therapy role once we've diagnosed? So we complete the laryngoscopies and support the doctors in the diagnosis of the condition. Once it's been diagnosed, we reassure the patients and we'll provide them with a block of therapy. So the main treatment for inducible laryngeal obstruction is with speech and language therapy. So they don't require any medications for this. A lot of the time, people that present with this condition will also have asthma, and the symptoms are very similar. They can mimic each other. So a lot of the time when people have been presenting to A&E or gone to the doctors, they'll be given lots of inhalers to try and use. But in actual fact, they're not going to do anything. They'll aggravate their symptoms more because it's their upper airway that's actually the problem, not their lungs. So we'll educate them, reassure them, and we'll provide them with breathing exercises to allow them to manage their throat better and open everything up easily. So again, I'll show you a video, and there is sound on this of my colleague who's performing a laryngoscopy. So she's a speech and language therapist, and she's doing the laryngoscopy, and she'll provide the patient with education around what to do So this individual has got inducible laryngeal obstruction, and you'll see that everything will become very tight and constricted, and with specific breathing exercises that she'll talk him through, he'll be able to open up his larynx again. So again, when we're doing the camera tests, we're looking for other things as well. So sometimes people will have reflux, and that can drive and irritate your throat and exacerbate your symptoms and make your ILO worse as well. And we're looking for kind of mucus around your throat as well, or postnasal drips. If you've got stuff dripping down from the back of your nose, again, that can irritate your throat, and that can lead to you being more symptomatic as well. So I'll show you that.
So just focus on your breathing. So gentle breath in, gentle breath out. In and out. And in and out. Perfect. Okay. So when you're ready, I want you to do a sniff in and then say E. Keep going, keep going, keep going, keep going, keep going, keep going, and take a deep breath in and out. Perfect. That's absolutely fine. Okay, and then count from 1 to 5 for me.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Perfect. Okay, and I just want you to do a throat clear. Okay. And can you try a cough for me, but of course just hold it back. That's it, perfect. That's fine, that's fine. Okay, so if you open your eyes for me, okay, and then face the screen, and I'll move with you.
Oh, hey.
Okay.
Oh, it's fine.
That's bloody awful.
We love it here. So,
Does that all look good, by the way?
That looks absolutely fine. I'll explain to you what I'm looking at, okay? So, I'm going to hold this steady. You keep steady as well. So, you can see... Actually, I might ask you to point to bits to the screen if you don't mind. Yeah, point to that hole down there. So that's your airway.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's what you're breathing in and out of. You've got 2 white bands.
Oh, at the back.
That's it. Those are your vocal cords.
Oh, right.
So when you say E, they'll come together and vibrate. Try that.
E.
That's it. Can you see they're vibrating now? Perfect. And then when you take a breath in, they open up.
Yeah.
When you hold your breath, they'll close.
Oh, right.
Okay. Now when you cough, do a little cough. They'll come together forcefully to expel anything from your airway. So when you do that over and over and over again, that hole closes.
Yeah.
That's when you pass out.
Yeah.
So the idea is you make that opening as wide as possible at any given moment.
Mm-hmm.
And the way you do that is with a little sniff in. That's it, so it's really nice and wide. And then 2 puffs out through rounded lips, so like you're blowing out 2 candles. Yeah, perfect.
Oh, that's perfect.
So it's a sniff, puff, puff.
A short sniffing.
Short sniff. Perfect. And that entrance to your airway completely opens up.
So this can have an impact on your voice as well. It can cause your voice to become quite croaky and hoarse. Because of the constriction, it causes a lot of muscle tension. So that's something else that we'd work on in speech therapy. We'd provide exercises to reduce that muscle tension intrinsically and extrinsically, alongside providing laryngeal care, so teaching you how to look after your throat and reduce that irritation that might be there from coughing, from the ILO episodes, from the muscle tension, from drivers like reflux and nasal drip. So it's very individualistic based on what we see on the laryngoscopy. We'll plan therapy for you, and based on what your concerns are as well. So yeah, in terms of the therapy, we'll base that on the assessment and information that we have. A lot of the time, you know, patients have to buy into what we're offering, because once they're diagnosed with this, they think they're going to be provided with a medication or an inhaler that's going to allow them to manage this, but actually there isn't anything like that available. It's management with behavioural therapy, and we normally offer them a block of 4 to 6 sessions. Once they've had the therapy, we'll bring them back in for another camera test, just to reassure them that there's nothing sinister in their throat, make sure that their techniques, they're using them correctly and they work for them, and make sure that they're confident to continue using those exercises. So we'd normally discharge after that, and then patients would just continue to manage those symptoms with the therapy that we've provided, and then we can always bring them back for kind of a refresher session if they need as well. So that's the end of my presentation. Thanks for listening.